in listen-only mode.
Hi, good afternoon. Welcome to this C2ES webinar on building business resilience to climate change. I'm Meg Crawford, one of the authors of Weathering the Storm, which is our latest report on this topic. As most of you probably know, C2ES is the successor to the Pew Center on Global Climate Change. Our core objective is to advance practical and effective solutions to our climate and energy challenges. And to that end, we undertake independent research, work with the business community on strategies and best practices, and advocate for policy solutions at the state, federal, and international levels. This is the first in our series of webinars on this topic. I'll provide the dates for future webinars at the end of our presentation this afternoon. So for today's agenda, I'm going to quickly run through some high-level messages from the report and then turn it over to our guest today, Jeff Williams from Entergy, to describe specific steps his company is taking to manage climate change impacts and build resilience along the Gulf Coast. We'll leave some time for questions as well. To ask a question, please type it into the questions box in your webinar control panel. And during the presentation, everyone will be placed on mute, and we'll get to questions at the end. And a brief note that this webinar is also being recorded. So from C2ES perspective, we undertook research on climate impacts and business resilience because we're already seeing the effects and costs of climate change today. And climate scientists are telling us to expect more frequent and intense heat waves, higher sea levels, and more damaging droughts, wildfires, and storms in the coming years ahead. And so we wanted to understand how companies perceive those risks and whether they're taking any specific steps to manage them. So with support from Bank of America, we looked in depth at the state of resilience planning among a cross-section of global companies. We did a comprehensive review of public documents from the S&P Global 100 Index, which is a group of 100 global companies across many different industry sectors. And we talked directly with companies to delve into specific examples of challenges and best practices. The resulting report provides a picture of how companies perceive their climate-related risks, the practices in business resilience that are emerging, and what barriers are standing in their way. Our report finds that nearly all of the S&P Global 100 companies, 90%, do identify extreme weather and climate change as current or future business risks. And these are the top 5 concerns that they described. For many businesses, climate impacts are already beginning to damage facilities, interrupt power and water supplies, drive up insurance costs, or disrupt supply and distribution chains. In fact, nearly 40% said they had already experienced such impacts, and nearly 2/3 expect to within the coming decade. But in several cases, companies described difficulty with understanding the risks sufficiently to take action. In particular, they described challenges with how to identify and quantify risks, given the lack of detailed enough information and tools that help companies apply these risks to a business context. So how are companies beginning to respond? Most are managing climate risks through existing business continuity or emergency preparedness or enterprise risk management plans, which is certainly a natural first step. But while those tools are certainly appropriate places to start, they often draw from a historical picture of risk and don't adequately reflect that future weather events are likely to be similar in type, but occur more frequently or be more intense. Only a few companies said they had used forward-looking, climate-specific forecasting tools to more comprehensively assess how these risks are evolving. So for example, some had conducted environmental or water-specific vulnerability assessments at all of their operations or at key sites. And those were generally companies very dependent on a key commodity or with operations in high-risk regions. A few leading companies are taking additional steps to build greater resilience to climate risk where there's a clear business case to do so, where they see opportunities to become more efficient, to reduce costs, or provide greater value to customers. And generally speaking, these companies followed a 4-step process. And most importantly, they build a common understanding across the company of the risks from extreme weather and climate change, based not on the past, but on what could change in the future. And they incorporate evolving climate risks into ongoing risk assessment and management activities and update them as new information becomes available. So in many ways, building resilience is doing what companies have always done: risk assessment, strategic planning, investing in infrastructure, diversifying the supply chain, and safeguarding employees using the best information available. We learned that this building resilience is seen as a proactive, strategic effort to make companies more flexible and competitive in a changing business environment. But it is still very difficult to determine how and when to change practices or make capital investments that would build resilience into the company's value chain. And that brings us to the final piece of our report, the obstacles to increasing business resilience. What companies tell us is that they need information. They need user-friendly, localized projections of climate change and models that link those projections to business impacts. Companies also need governments to invest in strengthening the resilience of public infrastructure that companies and society rely on, such as roads and bridges and ports. Companies, particularly in regulated sectors, such as water, electricity, or insurance, told us that they also need regulators to be open to companies making the case for increased spending on resilience and for policies that encourage customer decisions about sufficient levels of risk mitigation. And finally, the report recommends a voluntary public-private partnership that would bring together government and business expertise to develop and improve resilience planning. So that concludes my brief overview of our report. You can take a look at it in more detail on our website. And while we can't be sure about all the ways that climate change will manifest over the coming years, smart companies are recognizing that waiting to act can be a costly response. So I'll turn it over now to Jeff Williams to describe some of the studies and actions that Entergy is taking to better manage these risks. Jeff. Jeff, are you with us? Do I need to make him a presenter?
Hello? Can you hear me?
Jeff, are you there? Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay. Well, hi, I'm Jeff Williams. I work for Entergy, and the title of the talk today is Building a Resilient Coast is Vitally Important Even in Today's Climate. Could you go to the next slide? I wanted to share with you some findings from our Gulf Coast Adaptation Study, which takes a look at risks that we're facing into the future along the Gulf Coast. And also wanted to talk to you about some cost-effective infrastructure investments that we've identified as part of this process, and really give you kind of an idea of how we're thinking about climate risk and why we're so focused on building resilient communities. Next slide. Entergy is a utility headquartered in New Orleans, and we provide electric service to 2.8 million customers who live along the Gulf Coast in parts of Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, and Arkansas. In 2005 and again in 2008, we were hit with devastating back-to-back hurricanes. In 2005, Hurricane Katrina resulted in $150 billion of losses, largest in history. 80% of New Orleans was flooded. Families were displaced or stranded in the wake of the storm, and our people lost their homes, were out of work, and were left wondering about what they were going to do next. In October of last year, Superstorm Sandy hit the eastern seaboard and had some of the same stress effects on infrastructure, on economy, and on people's well-being. Go to the next slide. One of these are images from Katrina. As I mentioned, the storm had $150 billion of loss. Much of the city was flooded. Families were displaced. But one of the things that this was very evident to us was that these storms affected elderly and the poor in a disproportionate way. Those images we saw of people in New Orleans after Katrina were largely those that either didn't have a place to go or couldn't afford to leave the city and were disproportionately impacted. Next slide. From a utility perspective, we lost 1.1 million customers. The combined cost of Rita and Katrina were $1.5 billion. Entergy New Orleans was faced with devastating damages and no revenues to pay for that. But the big eye-opener was from Katrina was that while this number was large, 1.5 billion, we had to take Entergy New Orleans into bankruptcy to get it back. That was just 1% of the $150 billion of damage our communities and customers suffered. And while in the past we've been focused on business continuity and reducing losses to our assets, our larger strategic focus came towards working with our communities to enhance the prosperity of our customer base and building a more resilient future. You know, the fact of the matter is when our customers do well, we do well. Go to the next slide. So the question comes, what is the future going to bring? You know, it's very easy for people down the Gulf Coast here to look through the lens of the last storms that we've had and relate to the risks that we're facing in the future. Fact of the matter is we share common aspirations of building, enhancing prosperity, being able to make a good living, safety for our families, and preserving that quality of life that's so vital to the people that live down here. Our customers and employees are all living in these coastal communities, and they're concerned about the risks from today's climate. June 1st, hurricane season starts, and we're all wondering in the back of our minds what's going to happen. And even if not every one of us down here believes in climate change, in the back of our minds, we're still wondering about what the future is going to bring and what risks we're going to be facing. Next slide. When we started to focus more on what we could do to build the resilience of our customer base, we were frustrated because we didn't have good information. We had this anecdotal, top-down type estimates. But what we really felt we needed to have a conversation with our customers and communities was a very granular set of data. So we set out to do a comprehensive study to develop a fact base where we could quantify the risks in a very granular way. We began by mapping out assets in 4 coastal states, from Alabama down to Brownsville, Texas. We brought that down to a zip code granularity and mapped out where those assets were in terms, and broke them down into 23 different asset classes: residential, commercial, and various industrial classes. There was 800 zip codes across 77 counties and parishes. We then brought in Swiss Re, and they have proprietary loss models that they use, and we had them simulate a probabilistic assessment, simulate 10,000 hurricane years for each of a number of scenarios that we gave them. Scenarios for today, 3 scenarios in 2030, 3 in 2050, and 3 in 2100. Then ultimately took a look at 50 different adaptation measures to see how cost effective they might be in avoiding loss. Could you go to the next slide? We identified $2 trillion in assets that are at risk today. In this region of the country produces $634 billion in annual GDP. It's important not only to the local economy, but it's important to the nation. 50% of natural gas, 50% of refined gasoline and oil come through this region. Go to the next slide. I'm sorry. Could you go back 2 slides? I just want to explain how we. Okay, we did that one. Sorry. Okay, go ahead 2. We looked at 3 hazards. We looked at wind damage, sea level rise, and storm surge. Can you go to the next slide? We looked at 3 different scenarios for 2030, a low, a mid, and a high. For the low case, we specifically picked no climate change. In other words, the seas stop rising and the winds don't get more intense. We looked at a mid-range and a high range, which were based on IPCC estimates, and we gave estimates 2030 for increase in sea level and increase in hurricane speed. We specifically picked 2030 because we wanted to have a framework in close enough that would be relevant to people when they were thinking about this. My daughter will be my age in 2030. It's different than looking at risk out in 2100, which seemed far off. We also did 3 different cases in 2050 and 3 different cases in 2100. Really span the range of from a 550 ppm in 2100 to an 850 ppm. Next slide, please. These were some of the results that we got. One of the things was that the 100-year storms, the return period for the 100-year storm in 2030 would be 40 years instead of 100. And what you're looking at on this slide here is the return period and the estimated annual loss from those storms. So you can see 2030, the extreme case, the expected, and the base case, and then the line below there is today. So you can see that the return period gets larger. In essence, we could have a Katrina-like storm twice in a lifetime instead of once in a lifetime. And if you take a look at the 100-year storm, that increases from a $150 billion storm to a $200 billion storm. You know, in short, we're facing increased risk of losses. Next slide. Today, we're looking at $14 billion of average annual loss. We all know that the losses are lumpy. They don't come in average annual. But reporting out average annual loss from the Swiss remodeling gave us an opportunity to be able to take a cost-benefit approach towards some of the investments. In any event, it's no surprise there's a large risk, a large problem down in the Gulf Coast here today. That $14 billion increases to $19 billion by 2030 without climate change. That's strictly due to growth in the economy and loss of coastal wetlands protection, subsidence, issues with relative sea level rise that has nothing to do really with climate change. That represents, for the region, 6 to 8% of investment capital. In other words, each and every year, instead of investing to create greater wealth, we're investing in picking up the pieces and repairing damage that's coming. If you take a look at 2050, if you take a look at the layers of climate change scenarios, the mid and the high, that could be as high as $23 billion in 2030. If you go out to 2050, it could be as high as $40 billion. If you look at 2100, it could be anywhere from 130 to 200 million, but with a lot of uncertainty around that. Next slide. This is another way of looking at those numbers, the 14 billion in 2010. This breaks out the portion that's from surge, portion that's from wind damage, and a portion from business interruption. And you can see that storm surge going up to 2030 doubles, as does business interruption loss. One of the points I wanted to make when you take a look at this is going from 14 to 19 billion in the low case. This really isn't a climate change problem. This is a problem that gets worse with climate change. So this gave us an opportunity to, in conversations with our communities, to for those that might be skeptical about whether climate is changing or not, this is clearly something that's a problem today, and it's going to be worse getting into the future, and could be much worse with some of the climate change scenarios. Next slide. This takes a look at those same numbers again in 2030, but breaks it out by the states. And you can see that Texas and Louisiana each have about $7 billion of average annual loss, $3 billion for Mississippi and Alabama, and the $4.7 billion is for offshore assets. But if you take a look at this from the perspective of capital investment, you can see that, remember I was saying 6.8% of capital investment goes towards these losses. There's a disproportionate impact on Louisiana, who sees 12% of their capital budget going towards fixing these repairs, and 12 for Mississippi and Alabama. The economy's smaller there, but also Louisiana, 70% of the GDP for Louisiana is south of I-10 in this coastal area, and at risk from these hazards that we're looking at. Next slide. Here you can see how Louisiana is disproportionately at risk from storm surge. This is due to the fact that we're losing coastal wetlands protection. The Mississippi was levied off in the 1920s, which prevented the river from flooding and depositing sediment. So as that sediment gets cut off, each year the land subsides. And actually, this area of the coast is sinking more rapidly than any place in the world. So the combination of the land subsidence, sea level rise that we've seen, the intrusion of, as the elevation goes down, the sea level comes up, intrusion of salt water into these freshwater wetland marshes, killing off the vegetation, and then the soil erodes away, and we're seeing marshland, what was marshland, turning into open water. Next slide. This is a good slide to explain what I'm talking about. This is the Port Fourchon, Grand Isle area of Louisiana. Port Fourchon is a port that's responsible for providing equipment and materials to 90% of the deep offshore oil rigs. Its supply line for equipment and materials is this LA1 that comes down, and you can see this area up to the top of the screen, top left of the screen. That's within a levee. You can see that it's green, it's land. You can see once you get outside the levee that once was rich marshland is now turning to open water. The barrier islands, the first line of defense, is getting beat up by storms, opening up, subsiding, the marshland's going away, and now you have that levee system, which was the last line of defense, is now becoming the first line of defense. Next slide, please. This is a slide that looks out to 2030, and it takes relative sea level rise, 5 inches of sea level rise, 5 inches of subsidence, plus a 3.9-foot storm surge, which is the historic high storm surge. That blue area that you see there is what's inundated from that sea level rise storm surge combination. The red lines, the red LA1 there, shows that section of road is inundated as well. The port is inundated. So just 15 years out, this is what we could possibly see from another hurricane combined with sea level rise down here. Next slide. Now, while this all looks very stark, there are options out there that are cost-effective, where we can build greater resiliency, and this is what we were really trying to take a look at and identify through the study. Next slide. Multiple lines of defense is one of those cost-effective approaches. You could think of it as a series of speed bumps. You have barrier islands, which are your first line of defense. You have marshland, wetlands, which knock down storm surge, and then you have that in addition to levees. So you have this system of speed bumps out there, if you will, to knock down storm surge, and in reality you end up not having to build as large and massive a levee system, while at the same time you preserve those ecosystem services that those marshlands provide. You know, 9 out of 10 creatures that live in the Gulf depend some part of their life cycle living in the estuaries along coastal Louisiana. So if we lose that, we lose the fishery, commercial, recreational fishery, and all the ecosystem services those provide. In addition, you lose the protection from storm surge. In essence, the Gulf becomes closer and closer to the places where people live. Last year, Louisiana came up with their 2012 Coastal Protection Master Plan. It details $50 billion of investments over the next 50 years that will restore wetlands and habitat. A very detailed approach, and really takes into account how you would execute this multiple lines of defense. Next slide. What we did, we looked at 50 different adaptation measures, and then we stacked them up into a supply curve. What you're looking at in this graph here, on the x-axis you have loss avoided. The width of those bars are loss avoided, and then on the y-axis you have cost-benefit ratio. So we've stacked from the most cost-effective to the least cost-effective, and this is just illustrative. The next slide. This shows the actual supply curve. So here you can identify the different measures that we looked at, and those that have a cost benefit of less than 2 are below that dotted line going across the x-axis there. If you sum all those up, there's roughly a little over $7 billion of what we consider to be cost-effective measures that you could use to avoid losses. There's other things that are out here that may look like they're not quite as cost-effective, but remember, we're only looking at the loss avoidance. We aren't looking at how this ripples through the economy, and I'll explain that a little bit later. Next slide. This is another way of looking at this. What we have here is 4 different customer classes: residential, commercial, infrastructure, oil and gas, electric utility. We've identified 9 different cost-effective resilience investments that we can make. And then if you can see loss averted in 2030, that's taking a look, sort of a snapshot at how much loss will be averted in 2030 if you made the CapEx investments that are in the next column over there. If you go further to the right in the circles, you can see the cost-benefit ratios. And one of the things that jumped out at me when I first saw this was that this does not require all public funding. In fact, 2/3 of the investments, cost-effective investments we identified, would not require public funding. Building codes for residential, for example, making them stand up better to hurricane winds, elevating them, has a very high cost-benefit ratio and would go with the price of the house. The things that oil and gas industry can do to make themselves more resilient, the electric utilities can do, goes into the price of the product. There are certain things that do require public funding, and things listed here like beach renourishment, wetlands restoration, levee systems, those are the types of things that we do need to have public funding for, and there's some barriers in the way of actually carrying some of that stuff out. I wanted to point out this wetlands restoration has a cost-benefit ratio of 3, so you wouldn't think that would be cost-effective. But what we're looking at is strictly the loss avoidance that comes from restoring the wetlands. We aren't looking at the ecosystem services that are provided from that. And so when you take all of that into consideration into a multiple lines of defense type approach, cost benefit for that is much better. Let's go to the next slide. So this is what we end up with in 2030. That 21 billion of average annual loss. We've identified 7.5 billion that you can avoid through these investments if you invest today. It's not an easy task. You know, we're talking about investing $1 today, certain dollar today for perhaps preventing something in the future and in a bad economy. So that it's very difficult to be proactive, but in fact, we believe that these are cost-effective and we should be pursuing these options. There's still 14 billion of residual risk that's left. You know, this essentially gets us back to where we are today. We estimate perhaps 6.4 billion of that could be offset by insurance, but it really depends, and it's uncertain as to the price and availability of insurance to cover those losses. And then the remaining risk would have to be borne by the individuals. Next slide. Well, after we got the study done, we took these out and had conversations within our communities. We did what we called 11 Blue Ribbon Resilient Community Leadership Forums. This was led by America's Wetlands Foundation, but we participated in each of these. We went out to each of the communities, sat down with local elected officials, state officials, businesses, landowners, and had a conversation about how they felt about their risks and what they thought needed to be done. We started out by having a conversation with them about how resilient, how they rated themselves in terms of these 8 different factors of resilience, and came up with this spider diagram. Each one of those diagrams you're seeing there reflects one of the communities that we talked to. In general, you know, they felt that they rated themselves fairly high on disaster recovery and emergency response, warning, and evacuation. You know, I think in large part because we've experienced so many hurricanes down here, we have a lot of practice. They ranked themselves relatively low when it came to risk knowledge and coastal protection. So those were opportunities that they felt needed to work on. We took each of these forums and stitched them together into sort of voices of the community and summarized them and issued a final report, which we took to Washington last year, and identified recommendations on what we should do. Next slide. In addition, we also had 2 technical conferences with our customers. This was more focused with our customers. We went out ahead of time, picked a select group of customers to talk to, and just had a conversation with them. Where do you feel vulnerable? What have you done to make yourself more resilient? What do you expect from your utility? How can we prioritize our investments to complement what you've already done? And we had some amazing results. I speak about this example often. There was a plant manager in Orange, Texas. He had a polymer plant there, and he said when Hurricane Rita came through in 2005, that was a windstorm. That knocked down our transmission out of our Sabine power plant. It took us 4 weeks to rebuild that because it was out in open water and swamp. It was difficult to to rebuild. But when we did it, we rebuilt it to a higher standard to stand up to 150-mile-an-hour wind. He said in 2008, when Hurricane Ike came through, that was not so much a windstorm, that was a flooding storm. Their plant was under 3 to 4 feet of water. Their equipment was contacted by salt water. It took them 4 weeks to rebuild their equipment from the flooding. Our transmission stood up just the way it was designed, but they couldn't accept power. And it was like a light went off. Says, hey, wait a minute, if you elevated your equipment, which they now have, and we have hardened our transmission, which we now have, then we've reduced business interruption loss, we've avoided that impact to the economy, and we have some benefit. If we had just done hardening and the customer hadn't taken action to reduce their risk, there would have been nothing but added costs. We still would have those impacts. So it really gave an opportunity to be able to have a conversation outside our sector. The way we typically would do it in the past was we'd sit down with our engineers and draw a line, say everything south of this line here we're going to build to this standard, and may or may not have had the desired effect. One of the other things we found out is in some cases we're part of our customers' supply chain, and we're a vital piece of that and need to work together to keep the businesses up and operating. In other cases, we found that we share the same customer base. Every home needs water, they need sewage, and they need electricity. So a lot of times, we needed to work with other sectors in ways where they could get back up and operating as well. So it gave us an opportunity to collaboratively sit down and identify things that we could do. We identified 2 pilot areas and came up with a suggestion for additional hardening that we could do to our system. We identified what the loss avoidance would be, and then we brought in an economist who analyzed how that ripples through the economy. It's not like a Walmart losing its roof and has to pay to have the roof repaired. It's the lost sales that they suffer while they aren't operating. It's the lost wages. It's the lost sales tax revenue and all the ancillary effects of that. When they took a look at what we had proposed, 2 independent economists in 2 different areas estimated that for every $1 that we invested, we could have $5 of benefit in avoided losses, reduced business interruption loss. At the end of the day, we have those customers standing shoulder to shoulder with us when we go to our commissions to get rate recovery for additional hardening work, as opposed to having them intervene and oppose that added investment because of the added cost impact. They realize we've worked together on this. So that type of dialogue and collaborative process, we think, is really important. Next slide. So at the end of the day, we believe that there's cost-effective investments that are out there that are going to reduce losses. We believe that there's risks to critical infrastructure that we can avoid. And the question is, how can we as stakeholders work together to plan for a more resilient future? It's vitally important to us as a utility because we aren't going to go anywhere. That reducing that economic loss for the region, ensuring prosperity, safety, and quality of life is really important to our economic future. Okay, that's all.
Jeff, thanks so much. That was a Herculean effort to walk through a lot of really great information, and I think provides a really good overview of how Entergy has evaluated and prioritized where and also when to make investments in building resilience. We have a couple of questions in our queue. The place to ask a question for those on the phone is in the question dialog box in the webinar screen. I'll ask a quick question to you, Jeff, while we give more folks a chance to get their question in queue. So one question I had, I think that might be helpful for folks on the phone as well, is where some of the best sources of information are for companies to reach out and start to get educated about what the potential impacts are, and to use that information, to assess what their own risks and impacts might be on their company. You mentioned things like the IPCC and working with Swiss Re's proprietary information, but if you wouldn't mind kind of spending just a minute on that in terms of resources that were helpful to you, that would be great.
Yeah. Our science agencies do a wonderful job. NOAA, USGS, Department of Interior, NASA. Those, and in specific, the National Climate Assessment is going to be released, I believe, next year, and there's been a lot of improvements in how they take a look at this information and get it to the point where it's more predictive for localities as opposed to predictive for larger regions. I think they continue to make important advances there. So I think that National Climate Assessment is going to be a valuable source of information for everyone. NOAA does a great job with predicting things like hurricanes. Where is that going into the future? What are the impacts of climate on these extreme weather events? What are the connections there? NOAA just issued a report within, I guess, the last week or two, taking a look at things like was Sandy influenced by climate change, and concluded that there was probably a 50% increase in probability of Sandy level flooding compared to 1950 due to sea level rise, and with continued increases in the future, the risks increase. So it's with information like that that you can sit down and kind of anchor the scenarios that you're going to be working with. I think it's vitally important that you test yourself against future scenarios. And we down here have been talking about every time we have a hurricane, we sit down and figure out what went well and what didn't go well. But it's like driving in the rearview mirror. We haven't had the big one yet, and so testing yourselves against those scenarios of the future and finding out where we're vulnerable is really important. So how do you get credible scenarios of the future? I think these science agencies have information that we can use. I think the other thing is working with the reinsurance industry in particular. They're doing a lot of great analysis on what the risks are, and there's a shared benefit to us making cost-effective investments, taking loss off the table where we can. That affects the cost and availability of insurance. So it's almost like a partnership. There's the opportunity, I think, for risk-adjusted premiums, perhaps, based upon people that have made the investments to go to reduce some of their losses. So, that's another place that I go to, or some of the reinsurance agencies that have given a lot of good thinking to this.
Great, thank you. And this is a good question, I think. Follow on is, do you have suggestions for small energy utilities that don't necessarily have the capacity to do the extensive analyses that Entergy has done?
I think that that you can go to things like the National Climate Assessment and get ideas as to what risks that you're going to be facing. Is it water availability? Are you in a drought region? Are you in an area that's going to see increased flooding? And identify what those risks are, and then I'm really high on the idea of going out and talking to your customers, going outside your sector and finding out what they're doing and what you can do together. Prioritize your investments based upon that. All all towards looking to reduce business interruption loss. We quantified it, but I don't think you necessarily have to quantify it in as much detail.
Thanks, Jeff. Another question around sort of the timing and the long-term nature of some of these impacts. Will building and resiliency for 2030 continue to be effective in 2050 and even moving forward to 2100?
The risks are increasing. You know, what and where we build today will have to be reevaluated in the future, especially in areas, you know, if we're not successful in rebuilding coastal wetlands, that the losses we're seeing there of land, you know, those areas, what we build to today may not be adequate in the future. But I think that that's why it's vitally important that we test ourselves against these future scenarios, because if we build based upon thinking that the world's going to stay the way it is today, we're sure to not meet what we're going to see in the future. I've seen it just in comparisons with the short time I've been down here, comparisons of the flooding we had here in New Orleans from Katrina was not as much as we had from Hurricane Isaac last year, which was only a Category 1 storm, wasn't as intense, and yet there was record flooding on, throughout the area. So things change, and I think we're going to see increased risks from these going into the future.
Thank you. And we have a participant who's interested in knowing what level of resources Entergy invested into conducting these studies. What teams within the organization took the lead and supported the delivery of this analysis? Was the investment in the analysis internal or external?
This study was paid entirely by Entergy. The directive came from our CEO, who recognized that we really didn't have the granular type of information that would help when we had conversations with people about what you could cost effectively do. And the cost of the study was to us was $4 million. But we're still sharing that information with people throughout the coast. We had the 11 Blue Ribbon Resilient Community Leadership Forums. Each one of those, we shared this information. We're planning another 5 along the Texas coast in a new program called Texas Star, which is being put together. You know, I mentioned the Louisiana Coastal Master Plan. They're putting in applications for funding to do, for example, Barrier Island restoration. And we're able to take this information that we have and help them prepare their applications on how much loss would be avoided and what the impacts are behind the barrier islands. What are the losses that are avoided by doing that? So it continues to be useful information beyond just what we as a utility need to do. So anyways, it's been continues to be used.
Thanks. And we've had some questions about whether the studies that you've referenced today are available to the public, and I believe they are. So maybe can you just tell people where the best place is to access those?
Yes, you can go to the Entergy website, www.entergy.com, and click on Environment. I think it's Environment 2020, and you'll see some links to the study. One is, I believe it's called Building a Resilient Coast. It's sort of a summary white paper, and the other is a set of 29, 30 slides that have the results of the study.
Great, thank you. And we do have time for a couple more questions. So getting back to the Blue Ribbon Commission forums that you held, just curious to dive a little bit deeper on those. What kind of reception you received in those conversations, particularly around the respective roles of public and private funding in taking some of the steps and actions that you've outlined. And the second part of that question is, do you know of any that are similar commissions that are planned for example, the region around the impacts of Hurricane Sandy?
Well, these forums were organized by America's Wetlands Foundation, and we helped fund them, and we participate. I gave this talk at each one of these forums. It's a difficult conversation down here to talk about climate change, and so we made a point of, first of all, starting out by talking about the values that we shared together. I mentioned them in the talk. It's prosperity, making a good living, safety for our families, and preserving that heritage, that quality of life. It's pretty universal, and it's something that everybody's concerned about. And then from there, it was getting people to get into a risk management frame of thinking. We aren't asking you to believe this actually is going to happen. This is a low probability event but could have a huge impact. Test yourself against that and identify where you're vulnerable. And taking those two steps allowed a very good conversation to go on. We had good discussions about where they felt vulnerable. We had good discussions about where they felt frustrated and where they'd been putting plans together and couldn't get funding, or thought that something wasn't being done appropriately. And I think we got a good realization that no one entity can, in and of themselves, shield themselves from all this risk, that it really takes a collaborative effort. So the format was really kind of the same, where America's Wetlands Foundation went out ahead of time, interviewed a select small group, and then used that as the opening for the session, kind of summarizing what they'd learned from this, and that kind of built the agenda for the discussion. And then I would follow on with a talk about what the report had to say, and pointing out that there were cost-effective things that could be done and what they look like. And then from there, it was just a matter of having this good dialogue with people. And each area was a little bit different, but we were able to kind of summarize each one of those, and then put it into a final report. And if you're interested in more about this, if you Google Blue Ribbon Resilient Communities, it'll take you to a website where the reports of each one of these forums is detailed, and also the final report is there. To answer your question about are any of these planned on the East Coast, I don't know. I've talked to a lot of people who like the approach, and I suspect similar types of collaborative forums are being conducted. I know New York City did quite a bit of work. Also heard about a report that was I think it's called Risk and Resilience After Sandy, that was put out by the New York Building Congress, and has a lot of similar type information. So I know people are having these conversations and figuring out what it is they need to do to build greater resilience.
Great. And were these forum discussions and collaborations, were they conducted with your business and commercial customers, or residential customers, or both? Can you speak to that?
It was largely business and commercial.
Great. And I have another question here as well about how long it took your company to pull the study together.
It took us about 7 months.
Okay.
Part of it was scoping it out. We reached out to over 100 different experts to get ideas for how we should scope this thing, and then went through the preparing the study, and then reached out to those people again to give us feedback.
Great. Well, Jeff, thanks so much. I think we're bumping up against our 3 o'clock end time. Thank you so much for your contribution today, and thanks so much to all the participants for your time today and for your great questions. We do have, C2ES does have a few additional webinars related to this topic coming up across the course of the fall and winter. Most of these are held on Wednesdays between 2 and 3 o'clock, except the one on September 25th will be at 1:30 to 2:30. But you can register on our website, and those details about timing and how to participate will be there. Jeff, thanks so much. Any final thoughts from you before we dial off?
No, I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about this, and because I know these are things that we all have to think about. It may not be the same hazards, but I think the process of that we used is something that might help benefit people in different areas.
Wonderful. Well, thanks again, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Bye-bye.